there, it is Lisa Danforth, and I'm here today with the marvelous Marion Abrams. She is a podcast coach and podcast expert. Today, she's going to be sharing with us how to start a successful podcast. So many people are starting podcasts. So many people have existing podcasts that might be struggling, and Marion's going to be sharing a bunch about that. Before we jump in, though, Marion, I want to share a little bit about you with the audience so people know why you are the expert in your field. So Marion has been podcasting for 8 years, and she's got an incredibly diverse background in content creation, but also strategy. And her career began in documentary filmmaking in New York City, but the mountains of Vermont called her, and she's landed in Vermont. Today, she produces the Spartan Up podcast, which she co-developed with Joe DeSena, the founder and CEO of Spartan. And get a load of this. Marion has brought the Spartan Up podcast from an audience of 0 to over 30 million views in downloads. And it is the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And then also, Marion hosts her own podcast called Grounded Content. Thank you so much for joining me today, Marion.
Wow, I sound so impressive. Thank you.
Well, you are. You've got so much and I didn't even read the entire bio. So you want to jump right in?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to start with a really simple question. What is one essential thing that people need to be thinking about before they start a podcast?
Yeah, here's the question that people ask all the time. And the first thing is, I think people think that the thing they need in order to start their podcast is the best microphone. And what I tell them is the microphone is like the pencil, right? So a writer needs a pencil, but a pencil does not make a great writer, right? So yes, you got to have the microphone, but it's really not what it's all about. And so the biggest thing that I think people need to think about before they start a podcast is why. And there's this popular term of know your why. I don't actually mean that. I don't mean understanding your purpose in life. I mean, literally, why are you doing a podcast? And so what I like to ask people is, are you interested in monetizing, making money from this, selling to sponsors? Do you have a message that you feel like isn't being expressed anywhere in the media and you think it needs to get out there? Do you just want to express yourself? Some people watercolor paint, some people crochet, some people might want a podcast. Do you want to have great conversations because you want to explore a topic? Or do you want to serve an existing community? Do you want to take your community that you have and try to move them into customers? There's all these kinds of reasons to start a podcast. But if you don't kind of dial in the beginning on what your reason is, it's really hard to know the answer to the next question, which is, what would success look like? And if you don't know what success looks like before you start, it can get kind of disheartening on the journey.
You're talking my language. This is exactly the work I do with my clients, right? We have to have that clarity before we can know the actions to take to create the success. I love what you're saying.
Yeah.
So where do you suggest, like you're saying just before you've got the idea, I think I'd really like to do a podcast. I'm hearing you say pause, develop a plan, a strategy. And the first thing to ask really is why? What is the outcome that I am looking for that would be success for me?
Right. So I was very excited to find that there are kind of 5 steps or principles that I think are helpful to guide you in that journey. And they all start with P. So that was great. So my 5 Ps of podcasting.
Wow.
And so the first one, yeah, exactly. So the first one is purpose, which we talked about. Why are you doing it? And then the second one is your point of view. And so there are literally 2 million podcasts as of this week out there. And you don't have to be the only podcast on your subject. If you have a podcast about puppy training, there may be 20 other or 100 others, but yours isn't going to be the same as theirs. Mm-hmm. That's the point of view. And so really, don't try to be everybody else. Double down on you. Figure out what will separate your show from the other shows. It's a little bit of research and a little bit of not listening to anybody else, the hybrid of the two. But so that's the second one. The first one is your purpose, and the second is your point of view. Should I go through the rest of the P's?
I think you should go right through them, and we can dig deep if you want to. If anyone is listening and has a question, please pop it in the chat box so Marion can answer it and dig deeper on it.
Great. So the third one is process. And this is the one where all the kind of nitty gritty happens. And so this is where you're going to talk about, what's your show structure? What kind of guests do you choose? How do you format your show? So these are the questions that, do you use an editor? How do you work with an editor? All that stuff is the process stuff. And that's kind of the machinery that once you have that design for your show, you have to kind of turn on that machine and keep kind of refining so it will crank out and produce your show. So that's process. And there's so much obviously in that one where you can be strategic. But if you don't have the first two in place, that third one, you're going to be making decisions. You're going to be building a machine that doesn't serve your purpose. So number three,
in chronological order, right?
Exactly. Okay. And so number 3 is that process. Number 4 is practice. And this is one that people overlook because we all have conversations. So we don't think we need to learn how to talk to people, right? But the truth is, podcasting, interviewing, having conversations that are not just interesting to you, but to others is a skill. And it's a skill that you can learn. And it's a skill that you can continue to learn through your life and get better at with some coaching, by listening to yourself, with some of the techniques that I use. You can become great. I mean, that's my thing. My thing is I want to take people who have podcasts and I want to make them great. I don't, there's a phrase called pod fading. That's one of the P's I don't want on my list. And that is people who launch a podcast, they do a couple of episodes and they run out of steam because they're not either getting the results they want or they don't know what results they want. So and then the last P is promote. And so I go back to this idea that
I think so many people forget to promote.
Yeah. So this idea that there are 2 million podcasts out there. And the good news is that the average podcast listener is listening to just over 5 podcasts a week. So there's room for you to find a spot in there, even if they're listening to, some of the really big national podcasts. Once they're in the podcast world, they're looking for other good sources of entertainment or information or inspiration or whatever it is you provide. And so you need to be one of those 5. And so if you don't promote, anyone who's kind of been in the digital space knows if you write an amazing blog post and you put it up on your website, that doesn't mean anyone's going to read it. And so if you don't promote, all this other work is wasted. So those are the 5 Ps. And I actually recommend this isn't a one and done. This is a process you continue to do over and over and over again. And that's how you achieve excellence.
What is it, 10,000 hours or something like that, they say, in order to achieve excellence?
Yeah, and I don't like it because I don't like the idea that you can't start. Like you can start where you're at, and then you continue to iterate and improve.
I know one of the things that has helped me, and I still get nervous, and I've been doing this for, I think, a little over 6 months now, is just listening to other people. The flow, the questions, the tempo, all of it, right? To just watch and see what I like and see what I can integrate into my interviews as well. So
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about structure? You mentioned structure. I think it was in the 3rd P, because I think that's incredibly important as well. Dig a little deeper on that.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that I think is important to say is we use this term podcast, and I think there's an assumption that a podcast is an interview. There are many solo podcasts. Mm-hmm. There are many co-hosted podcasts where they're just talking to each other. There are interview podcasts, but there are dramatic podcasts, documentaries, comedies. There are all different kinds. A podcast just means it's spoken audio content. So it doesn't have to be an interview. And that's a great opportunity for a creative person to really say, like, how can I look at this in a different way and create a structure that is different, that serves my purposes? And so by structure, there's a couple of things. One is, within each episode. So within the episode, sort of the standard generic show structure, and it's standard because it's a good structure, is you have your music comes up at the beginning, you have your intro, and that's where you say, today I talked to Lisa Danforth, and she's going to tell me the 3 ways that I can grow my business in a sustainable way, right? Whatever it is that you want people to stay for, you give them that clue. And then you have your interview, and then you're going to have your close, which could be your call to action or your wrap up or your kind of takeaways. And then you have your music. So that's sort of a standard structure to a show. But once you know the standard, you can change that. So you can do anything. And your structure can be related to your schedule. So a lot of people do maybe an interview 1 day a week and a solo tip or inspiration another day a week. Or they may do a 5-minute every morning motivational piece. So understanding kind of your structure is how you build out what the show looks like so that you can plug all those pieces in.
Excellent information. And as you're talking, I was thinking of what's the average time that you should start? I know there's something like once it gets over about 40 minutes for me, I'm like, okay, that's 2, right? So it's kind of a transitional time. What do you recommend for people who are starting or who are looking to build their podcast
for the length of the show? Yeah, It's such a good question. I love this question because this is one of the beauties of podcasting is it doesn't matter. So it matters, but it doesn't matter. And what I mean by that is in broadcast television or broadcast radio, you have to be, 47 minutes and 36 seconds or whatever it is so that there's room for the commercials and room for the next show to start. Podcasting, the length of your show is the length that it needs to be to cover the information, to stay interesting. There used to be a theory that 22 minutes was the ideal time for the commute or something like that. There's a guy, Rob Walsh, who does customer support and data for Libsyn. Libsyn is one of the bigger podcast hosting companies. And they do a lot of analysis of their data. And one of the things he did was he looked at the top 200 podcasts that had been in the last whatever that time period was. And he looked at how long they were to see if these patterns or these theories that are out there hold. And he found basically the short version is it doesn't matter. Really? Some of the top 200 were very short. Some of the top 200 were very long. And some of them were middle length. And so you could check his podcast and find the exact data. I can't remember the details, but the general message was make your podcast the length it needs to be. So again, if you're thinking about maybe you're a fitness coach and you want to do a daily motivation, something that people will listen to every morning, first thing when they start the day. Well, that might want to be 5 or 10 minutes. But if you're somebody who wants to have a really in-depth conversation and cover some really deep issues, that may be much longer. So it really depends on what it's like everything in podcasting. When you have the first 2 questions, right? You have your point of view and your purpose. Everything else is generated out of that. And so the other big thing I think that's so important is you've got to balance your goals with your resources. So your resources are your time, your money, your team. And one of the most important things to do early in the process is really look at what are the resources you have and you're willing to expend and what are the goals. And then, it's a 2-part thing. How do you best put them together to get the results you want? And is it realistic to expect the results given the resources you're willing to put into it? That's another kind of early question is doing that balance. That's part of that early stage, but it's never too late to do that. So you could be 2-3 years into your podcast and you can still do this same process with me.
Sounds like it's something that you would actually want to continually go back through, those 5 Ps, right?
Absolutely.
It's just sort of refresh, pivot, whatever it may be. Can you touch on what are the resources? Like I've heard someone say you really need a minimum of $10,000 for investment to get a decent podcast up and running. Can you
that's
talk a little bit about that? Because I've heard it run from podcasts are great. You just sort of jump on to minimum of 10,000.
So again, I hate to just keep harping on it. Everything comes back to the first two P's, right? Your purpose and your point of view. But absolutely saying that you need to have $10,000 to start a podcast is ridiculous.
Okay,
right?
That's good to know.
It's ridiculous. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't great podcasts that cost significantly more than that to produce. But you think about the difference between your Instagram video that you made with your phone and you posted, and that may serve your purpose perfectly. All you did was you held your phone up and you talked into it, right? What's your purpose, right? Why are you doing it? Are you doing it to entertain your friends or to even from a business point of view, let everybody in your neighborhood know what the dinner specials are tonight at your restaurant, right?
Perfect.
But there's also, the latest HBO series, with the Marvel characters. Those are all video production. Just like a podcast may be me speaking into my phone and reminding members of my community of something that's important to all of us. Mm-hmm. Or a podcast could be, Radio Lab or one of the big NPR shows. So again, looking at why you're doing it, what you want to achieve, looking at realistically what you're willing to put into it, and then making those measurements.
I love what you just said because it really makes the threshold low, right? The barrier to entry, because I think so many people can think they've got to get all of this, thousands of pieces of dollars of equipment in-house before they even start. So I think you really opened up the door for a lot of people, because if you again, jumping on your phone, I think that's amazing.
The thing is, think about what you're doing it for. I know I'm repeating myself.
Can we throw an extra P in there? Pause.
There's so many P's. There's pause, there's plan, but I picked 5, but there are infinite number of sub-level P's.
So what is one mistake that almost everyone makes, or one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they are either launching or maybe scaling a podcast?
Yeah. So one of the big mistakes, there's so many, right? One of the big mistakes is thinking that a big name guest is going to be the best way to grow your audience.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So there are strategic ways and reasons to use guest choices. This is for an interview podcast. There are strategic ways to do it. But the truth is, if you get Gary Vaynerchuk on your podcast, that's super cool, right? He's very well known in the podcast world and outside of it. But think about this. If somebody wants to know what Gary Vaynerchuk wants to say, where are they going to go? They're going to go to his media. Right. So they're not going to come to your podcast for that. They're going to go to his.
Wouldn't that build some credibility for you, though?
Absolutely.
Yes. Caliber.
Exactly. And so that is part of the puzzle. What that does for you, again, going back to your purpose, but also a bunch of other things. So one of the purposes that a lot of people start a podcast is to establish themselves as a thought leader or an authority on a subject. And so having a big name guest can really help in terms of your authority building. It also has a secret power that does help in your growth. And that is that other guests become easier to book. So if you can say, Lisa, would you be on my podcast? Gary Vaynerchuk was on last week. You're going to say, yes. You're not going to say, how many downloads do you have? Or, how long have you been around? You're going to say, you betcha, I'm in. Right. So it does help from that point of view. And then the other end of the spectrum is smaller guests who are going to be so excited to be on your show. They're going to share it everywhere. They may not have an audience. So even that enthusiasm and that sharing may not build your audience. But there is one kind of guest that will help you build your audience. And this is these people that are speaking with expertise to your subject. That don't have a huge existing platform of their own. Some of them have kind of a growing following. And if you can find those people, and we've, on Spartan Up, there were a few of those that stand out. There's 2 or 3 every year that just continue to accrue organic downloads and listens in perpetuity because people want to hear that stuff and they're looking for it.
Right. Continuing, I don't want to continue to say on the negative, but continue on the mistake. You talked about pod fading before, which I've heard you mention before, which I just find fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about that and how to avoid it?
Yes. So first of all, one of the things I think is important to know is doing a podcast doesn't have to be forever. So you can do a podcast. It doesn't have to be every week, and it doesn't have to be in perpetuity. There are many podcasts that have a finite life that are built around an event or an occurrence in the person's life, or maybe you could create a podcast when you're publishing your book and you have 10 principles in your book and you do 10 episodes, one on each principle, and that's it. So that might be what they call evergreen content, meaning it will be valuable in perpetuity. It's evergreen. It's always interesting. But if you are pod fading, there are kind of 3 solutions that I like to think about. And pod fading is a thing. And if you get into the podcasting community, you will see it's something people talk about a lot. But there's kind of 3 ways to deal with it. One is take a break. And there's ways to do that without losing your audience. So what you would do, yeah.
No, I was just saying, I appreciate the fact that you're saying to people, quit pushing through. If it's just too hard, take a break, make sure it's in alignment, right? Thank you for sharing that.
So that's one way, right? So one way is to take a break, and you can do that and still serve your audience if you create a sort of a pre-break episode and you kind of address the fact that you are taking a break, and maybe even recommend 3 or 4 past episodes that are evergreen that new listeners who have just found the show might want to listen to. And you let them know that it is a break. You're coming back, and maybe even set up a notification system so that you can get people back into the stream of things. The other way is the opposite. Surprisingly, sometimes when you double down, you get re-energized. So sometimes if you are doing a podcast and you've just kind of been trundling along and getting it done, if you double down and say, okay, I am going to really make a go at it. I am really going to grow this thing. I've been doing 1 episode a week. I'm going to do 2. I am going to, spend more time working on guests, on process, whatever it is. Sometimes doubling down will re-energize you. And then the third way to do it is to really think about, most people do a podcast on a subject. So I talked yesterday to a guy who's a firefighter, and he had a podcast about firefighting. And doing the activity, in that case, maybe it's not quite as appropriate, but, doing the activity that inspired it, maybe working with firefighters, finding out what their message is, going back to the thing that you do that you're talking about. So sometimes a podcaster, you talk about, there's actually a podcast out there about Pez dispensers. And, right?
No way.
And it's a good podcast.
How many
so that person, maybe this is just an example. This isn't the case with their show, but for example, that person could be so involved in podcasting that they've disconnected from the thing that got them excited in the first place, the Pez dispensers. And so sometimes the way to kind of reinvigorate yourself is to find ways to get back into the thing that you're podcasting about.
I love that. Number 2 really sticks out for me because I talk a lot about habits, right? So what went through my mind was creating that identity-based habit of, as a podcaster, right? As a podcaster, this is how it would show up. As a successful podcaster, this is what I need to do this week. And it allows us to step forward with much less stress, I think.
Yeah, I like that. Can you explain a little more? How would you go work with a podcaster who was, or, a creative who was fading? How would you help them?
Well, like you, I would reconnect them. Why do you want this, right? So looking at the long-term goal that they wanted, so that we can then create short-term goals in context to that long-term goal, right? So we can re-identify as someone who has a successful podcast because the impact I want to make is X. So a goal is a place to come from, not get to. So
I like that, adding in the identity piece. That's a big part. I think I'm going to add, it's not a P, but I'm going to add that to my list.
R&D. But what it does is it allows us to identify as someone who is a podcaster.
Yeah.
And that just invites us to step forward as opposed to identifying as someone who wants a podcast, but they're really struggling with a podcast and aren't really sure what to do.
Right.
It's just
Right.
a simple mindset shift that allows people to step forward and let go of the weight of not being successful.
Right. Right. I like that.
Yeah. What are some resources that you have utilized or that you would recommend for someone who is looking to, again, start or increase their podcast?
There are some really good and really bad resources out there.
All right, so let's focus on the good resources.
So there are some really good Facebook communities. One of my favorites is She Podcasts, and that is a women or women identifying podcast group. It's a very supportive community. This is not the place to go and say, I just started a podcast, go listen to it. This is the place to go to learn and get support and encouragement.
Be a sponge is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's not a place to promote yourself. It's a place to support each other and grow. Mm-hmm. So, and then there are two other Facebook communities around two of the big conferences. One is Podcast Movement and one is Podfest Expo, Global Expo. Those have great supportive communities as well, different cultures. So if you go to one and you kind of don't like the culture, try another one. And if you are more of the techie side, there's a really great group called Just Busters, which is for female podcast editors. It's very specific.
Just Busters.
Yes, they're busting the idea of saying I'm just a podcast editor.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Right. Just is one of those minimizing words that women especially will say, well, I was just thinking.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to check that one out.
So there are great resources there. Should I keep going?
If you've got a couple more, share them, because I'm sure the audience and whoever's listening, I know we've got a bunch of people on here. If you have some questions, please post them in the chat. And if you're listening to the replay, please post your questions in the chat. Marion will definitely pop in and answer them.
Yeah, especially on LinkedIn. I will go back through and I will check in the future. So another place is Clubhouse. And there's a lot of conversation right now about Clubhouse. Right now it's still in beta, so it's only available on iPhone. But as an audio platform, you can imagine that podcasters are super active in there. Mm-hmm. I will say there are great resources, incredible conversations. But if you see a room title with a whole bunch of like bags of money in it, or you hear, people talking about how you can monetize your podcast before you even launch, or concepts like guest-facing monetization, just listen with skepticism. There are a lot of people out there right now who maybe have been podcasting for a month or two, or maybe have been podcasting for a year or two, but have never seen success, that are telling you how to be successful. And there's some sketchy stuff. There's some really good stuff. And there's some really generous conversations where great information is being shared. But again, if it doesn't sound right, if it sounds too good to be true, please step back and find another room.
Perfect. Those are great tips and tools. Thank you. So is there any question that I didn't ask you that you would have asked yourself?
Well, I will jump to just one thing that we kind of touched on before we finish up, and that was the interviewing. And so you were talking about how it's a skill to learn to sort of be present and listening, but also thinking ahead. And so one of the techniques I talk about with interviewers is, I call it time hop, but there's a couple of techniques to prepare that help you do that. And so the time hop basically is just exactly what you were saying. It's that idea that you need to be present and listening, but you also need to be in the future because you need your next kind of direction and question. And what I find really helps people with that is, before you start the interview, really think about one ultimate thing, essentially, that this guest has a value to convey to your audience. Mm-hmm. So what is that essential guiding principle?
Not that.
So find that principle, then write out 20, 30 questions. And as my friend Colonel Nye says, it's not the plan, it's the planning. And so you write out your 20 questions because that process is helpful for you. And you know that one essential thing. And the other thing is, it's okay to have a piece of paper. And in fact, most guests, if you have a piece of paper and you say, let me check my notes, they actually feel respected because they feel that you've taken the time to do the preparation and the research. And so those tools will help you to kind of do that time hopping of stay present and move into the future. And that's one of the things I work with people who want to get better on their interview skills.
I absolutely adore that, and I'm going to R&D that one as well because I just think it's brilliant. It is, and it's tough. It's definitely something to practice, right?
Yeah. All of these they're all process oriented. And I think of it like a spiral staircase. You learn the same lesson again and again and again, but each time you're a little further up the staircase and you learn it in a new way.
Perfect. Always be open, right? This is great. Marion, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing your brilliance with the audience. Where can people reach out and connect with you?
I am Mad Motion. So I have a website, which is madmotion.com. You can find me there. I'm here on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, please connect with me, send me a message, ask me a question, either in the chat or in the DMs. And I'm Mad Motion on most of the social media platforms.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just want to say, if any of you found this episode incredibly helpful, insightful, inspiring, please share it with someone that you know, someone that you care about. Share it, put it out there. There's a lot of great information that Marion just shared. So thank you so much. And then next week, February 1st, blows my mind that we're in, April 1st blows my mind. April 1st, how about I lose a couple of months? I'm going to actually be talking about habits. I'll be talking about identity-based habits and how we really need to focus on our habits because that is how we create the success that we're looking for. So join me next week, next Thursday, April 1st at noontime East Coast time for a discussion on habits. And I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. To everyone, have a fantastic day and we'll see you next week. Thanks, Marion.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
All right, thanks. All right, bye. Thank you, CJ, for joining us.